Nobody's going to argue if we go to lunch sooner. Yeah. Or not. Or you said. I just think talk about some of the pieces that we're dealing with in corn. We've got just ways, different management approaches to mitigate some of the issues. I know that we've got a build up of first spot, which it builds each year. Last year, a little bit earlier, but we just wanted to touch base on that. Different ways to get to the pie. Just things to consider when looking at a crop and saying, what's the best way to lower the risk of this so familiar with the seed triangle. You've got to have the environment, the pathogen, and the host. That's what we've got all three of them. But how that environment comes in, we're planting corn, so we're going to have, we got the host. We know the pathogen present because we've all seen car spot the last couple of years. So now, do we have the conditions that are going to be creating a problem? So the three of them, this is just my take on it, but the primary concern in this area that we're all in, gray leaf spot, have to deal with that for years. Northern leaf blight, and then bar spot kind of creeping in and causing issues the past couple of years. So when we looked at the different conditions, and it goes back to what I said, we have the host, we got the pathogen, they're all around. Now we look at the environmental conditions for it. So for northern corn leaf blight, moderate temperatures, good conditions, wet leaf surface, contains higher nitrogen levels in the soil, no-till, or reduced tillage, heavy dew, affect the crop about any time, and add it with hybrid selection to a certain extent. We look at tar spot, cool temperatures. Northern corn's moderate, tar spot's cool, approximately the same temperature range, humid conditions, prolonged leaf wetness, minimal till. Again, corn's susceptible to it. And there are some hybrids out there that have a greater degree of tolerance to it, but by and large, at least 30 bushel or really ways to get. So one may respond a little better to it, but still take a yield loss if we have a heavy infancy. Then we look at gray leaf spot. We've been dealing with that for years, but it's warm temperatures. Again, humid conditions, leaf wetness, minimal till, right on down the line. So what's the conditions for decent corn growth? Lots of moisture, have very temperature change. We can have up to 85 degrees during the day, 5 at night. Well, there's windows for all of that. He's coming in. So whatever we have conditions for corn growth, goes at the end. Or also conditions for one of these, we're going to get caught with something generally. We have a drought where everybody's corn burns up. So then we kind of look at the, okay, what's the options that we have to deal with to help mitigate some of this disease pressure? So at planting, seed treatment, pre-seed. Every company offers very good seed treatment. Some of them are just a little higher level package, you pay a little extra for it, but they're pretty good. I mean, great insect control, some fungal pathogens, suppression on others. Environmental conditions, when we go and put that into the ground, it may exceed their suppression capacity. And just the example is crown knot. You know, we've got Fusarium, Butadiene, Arachnodes, Pythium, Rhizoctonium. It's a complex. Nobody really knows the cause of it. So specifically, that's what it is, but it creates crown knot and possible scar infection. But then, while it may work on some fields, if you have a problem in the past, you may want to go, okay, I'm not going to rely strictly on it. Then we look at a fungicide applied with a starter fertilizer. Highway, been pretty effective, had shown very positive results through the past few years, and it's kind of another layer of suppression on some of the ground stock crops. Label-wise, full gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, and it's got a supplemental label, tar spot suppression. It also says in the different, but in the label, it says that they come in on a late and need a late fungicide application, depending on seed pressure. But I don't think a guy should go, okay, I'm going to put down Xyway and I'll have to think like colors or whatever it is, starter. I can walk away, come back and look at the corn, it's September, and I'm telling it, it's quite good. So another option, if I'm not going to deal with fungicide, I don't like the price or whatever the issue, don't want to look at that, you can come in on a P8, P7, P9, P8, P10, apply a fungicide on there. It does give good control on grazing spot of those three that were targeted, and they can mitigate some of that crop stress. That maybe hot time, hot temperature, a little drier conditions allows the plant to go ahead and weather that stress a little bit. I would look at this if we skip fungicide at plant. Don't want to deal with it. This is a good option to come in, make an application. One thing I kind of italicized this next line there, but when we look at last year, when we had tar spot, it came in about the first half of July, it started popping up all over. We look at our early planted corn, everything that was put in the ground in late April, therefore we saw a lot of tar spot issues. Then we turned around and looked at the corn later on, that was planted later on, corn at the end of May, that disease pressure was much less than that July timeframe. So it leads me to believe that we all remember the 2.5 weeks of everybody was staring at the shop walls, waiting on the ground to dry out, part of May, and then 2.5 weeks of May, cool, wet, corn in the ground. I'm firmly convinced that that's when it was affected tar spot. So we had to do, if we would have came in our P8 application, probably would have cleaned that up. What's an advantage is you can use your existing sprayer. It gives you an opportunity to throw in another micronutrient, a pitch for, I like boron on corn, go back to that slide or the presentation, we were talking about when to apply that, when that uptake curve was coming. It gives a good opportunity for that. We can also use a lower, quote unquote, generic product, something that's not going to cost us $15 an acre or more. Let's look at something a little less, and cost-wise, it will allow us to go ahead and push, have conditions conducive for a higher infestation or seed pressure. We can come back in at a later time longer residual product. So I threw an example. You guys that work with, they probably recognize my format there, but Code Excel, I think it's cheap enough. I wouldn't go to lower rates the way they promote it. Throw in half rate of the boron, 10% product, 15 gallons of water on there. But then take either one of those applications, nothing at planning and nothing at P8. That BTR1 application window probably the best option. Go in there, we can add in a boron, or you can add in a micro. You know that's going to get it. More payback on that. Sometimes we end up with some set pressure, flipping silk, whatnot. They're not blanket applying insecticides, only you don't need them. Nothing up to do it or anything. I just don't like to kill off everything. But that application of that BTR1 is a little bit early for that season-long control, residual control, that plant health. But then, I should have broke this slide up a little bit, but go back to our planning application of, say, that Xyway product, or we come back in with the generic FP8, then now we can look at an R1 to R3. I know it's R2.5 is not a growth stage. I come up with, but if we come in late, if that plant protected pretty well, and we've got great leaf spot, or we've got northern, or we've got tar spot, pressure or conditions are dictating that we're going to have pressure. We can come in and make that application as late as possible, pick up, knock off the seed, that residual there, and keep that plant green. So when we look at grain fill, I want that corn plant, I don't want to turn in premature death on it, because we're going to start losing grain fill weight. But there's a lot that goes on late in the season. That plant is possible. That's why we want to shove that fungicide application as late as possible. And that is just kind of again, I just kind of screenshotted that in there, you know, the water. And there's a lot of really good products in that range. You know, that's a lower end rate of it. Got boron in with that. It's got a fact that that's an aerial application. Nobody really wants to drive through corn like that. Okay, I get to talk about the stuff that nobody wants to talk about. So as Jim's talked about, tar spot is really, so the question is do we need to make a second application? Do we need to be in something in that R2 to R5 range to get complete tar spot control? And this is a tough one because it costs a lot of money. And we can't just build this program out and say, yep, just do it no matter what. But there's a couple things we have to think about here. And first of all, if we're doing a fungicide application at VTR1, that gives us about 14 to 21 days of protection. We have about 42 days of grain fill. And if we don't protect that plant all the way through, over half of the dry matter gets added from R3 to R5. And that's a real problem because of tar spot. With gray leaf spot and northern leaf blight, we've got some genetic resistance built into most of the varieties you're planting. And if we make that one fungicide application, we can usually get by without having to do it again. Sometimes, but not always, tar spot may come in later.
And if we have, as Jim said, the disease triangle, if we have the right environmental conditions, because we know the inoculum's there. I mean, every single field, particularly as we are from basically Columbus west, we've all seen a lot of tar spot there. As we go east, maybe not quite as much, but I'm going to say pretty much in our whole trade area, all the way to New York, that we have that inoculum for tar spot there. So then it becomes a question of, do we have the right environmental conditions? And today, nobody can answer that question. But what I think my goal here is for you guys to think about what you're protecting and what you're not protecting. Now, a good approach is what Jim was talking about, is if we can delay that application to like R2, got a pretty good chance of making one application and covering ourselves on tar spot and being done. But if you're doing like a Xyway program and nothing else, and you come in at VT at Tassel for your gray leaf spot in northern and trying to get that chunk of tar spot, you're exposing yourself to the second half of the grain fill period. You're putting at risk the 55% of that dry matter grain fill that's going to be there. And I don't have a take-home message, do this, this, and this. My message to you guys is think about this as a system and think about what's your disease plan. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So you can, first of all, you can have a plan, because you're not going to call up your drone pilot or your airplane or your ground rig guy and say, I want you to spray my corn at R2 today, because it's going to go from R2 to R4 really fast and you're going to miss the window. So the plan needs to be today what you're going to do if tar spot comes in. So from an economic standpoint, this is where it gets really, really dicey. The products that do the best on tar spot are your most expensive products. They're going to be your $20 plus per acre products. And there really is no shortcut around that. We've had some guys like thinking about using Quilt XL. Quilt XL has some activity on tar spot, but it's really not that good a product for that particular disease. You're going to need to look at Aveltima, Delaro, Miravis Neo, and there's some others I didn't put on the list. I just listed the ones that are most popular. Like I said, that cost is going to be $21 to $23 an acre. So before you spend that money, you really want to make sure you're going to get a return on investment. You're also going to have about $14 to $17 an application, because you're having to get it air applied, most likely, ground applied maybe, but no matter what, it's going to cost you about $14 to $17 an acre. You put that together, that's $37 an acre. And that's a big number when corn's $4.50 a bushel. You need about 8 bushels. That number should be burnt into your head. You need about 8 bushels to break even on this deal. And that's a pretty big number to get. Except if we have severe tar spot, it can be 30 to 50 bushels per acre. I'm not trying to scare you into this, but I think you have to also realize you cannot bury your head in the sand and say, I'm done spending money, because that last $30 may be the $100 that you get back on it. Once again, if corn's $6 or $7, well, I'd really wish that would happen. That would make this so much more fun to talk about. But it's probably not. Who knows? And with all this, scout. With the integrated ag, you need to partner and don't get sucked into 300 bushel corn. I'm just going to spray it, because there's just not very much money in this. But if we scout, and we pragmatically approach this, I think we can decide whether we need to pull the trigger or not. And if we do, we should feel pretty good that you will see 10 to 12 bushels of yield response in those worst case scenarios. So have a plan and try to build that plan such that you've got flexibility. The idea of making that first application someplace in that R1 time frame and do go a long ways towards not having to do it again. And be prepared. I think that's all I've got here, Jim. Okay, I guess I got one more slide. When to pull the trigger. So this is a map. These are all the counties, United States, that have had tar spot in them. And we're slowly but surely seeing this all creep across the United States. And it's kind of a cool season disease, like Jim said. So it seems to be more of a problem to the north and to the south. But we're basically marching across pretty much all the corn producing states, major corn producing counties in Ohio at this point. So I think both Jim and I are of the opinion that it's here. It's not a matter of, well, I don't have it yet. It's here. The inoculum is around. So what should be your target areas? Once again, if you've got gray leaf spot in northern, it makes it a little easier because you're probably going to apply a product that's going to give you some tar spot activity. So that makes it a little easier. You're going after more than one disease. Got high yield potential. That probably means you've got really good growing conditions, which probably means you've got really great disease environment. So if you're sitting there in July and you're going, this corn could be 240 plus, you probably ought to be thinking about what your disease approach is going to be on that late season. For tar spot, it's moderating temperatures. It's 2023 where we had a lot of cloudy, smoky, cooler conditions. That's really gonna build itself towards when we can see more tar spot. And if grain prices go up, cross our fingers, makes this decision a little easier. If you've not made any application and you're into R2, you really need to pay close attention and really be scouting your fields because you really have got nothing set up at that point to help you out. And I think that's my last slide.
All righty, somehow we managed to finish early, so that's a good thing. So we'll go ahead and do Q&A before lunch. Here we got about 15 minutes. So. First question is, what is your source of crop removal rates of micronutrients?
Trying to remember which table we looked at. Put it together a while back. It's either crop protection network or OSU probably produced. There's where we kind of pulled that out. I put it together a while ago.
All right, next question is, what is the answer to correcting nutrient stratification? I've got my opinion.
Moldboard plow, there you go. They're really, I mean, there are some pretty hardcore no-tillers that are going into doing some sort of deep tillage practice every so many years just to kind of break things up and try and mix that profile up a little bit. I don't doubt is anybody here still got a moldboard plow that works? In the shit. So that's probably not an answer. I don't know. You got an answer, Evan?
Not a very good one. Mary Cullman did some research on this. I can't remember what the results were in that, but at the end of the day, it really impacted yield that much.
That would be I think there's bigger fish to fry than that. You can solve the stratification problem and create a plow pan problem or an erosion problem. I personally don't worry about stratification much.
Next question is, the formula for potassium crop removal as good at the high yields, like some fields had in 21 and 23, as it is with normal?
So that equation gets broken into two parts. Part one is we're trying to identify where we've got high, medium, and low potassium levels. And that's what that index is for. The second part is we use crop removal. Most of the time we use crop removal from your yield data to replace what was taken off. So that is the removal piece. So the equation works fine for what it's doing, and we're just allowing the yield data to drive the crop removal, or we'll use a yield goal to drive that.
Care to share any thoughts on precision planting, ground agronomics at home soil testing labs? Yeah, I know at Commodity Classic they had this out there last weekend, and I heard about it about a year ago as well. So, mobile testing labs, or I don't know if you call them necessarily mobile testing. Soil testing equipment is kind of complex, and MICP machine. I'm sure it's accurate, but at the end of the day, it comes down to still got to have the density of still collecting samples. So putting it into this mobile soil testing lab. If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's kind of hard to explain. You probably have to look it up, but essentially, you pull your own soil samples and put them into this mobile lab, and it will spit out soil testing. But it still comes back down to can't get around that. High density. Next question: doesn't Skyway will all be good soil micro? No. All right. That's thoughts on in-furrow starter programs? What should we be targeting to accomplish?
On in-furrow, kind of look, both sides will kind of match the 5 gallon. 5 gallon is kind of a sweet number because we have enough flow to make sure that we have even distribution across the different units. And so there's some really good products out there, 618.6, 624.4, that type of thing. That's good and clean. I like 1034.0 at 2.5 gallon because it gives us about 10 units of phosphorus, and you can add a quarter zinc. The problem with 1034.0 is kind of a vocabulary when we get a little bit of salts and stuff in there, plug screens, and then you're sitting there with especially whoever told you to 1034.0. But there's some good, we don't, potassium doesn't affect that much for that. So we look at phosphorus and zinc. Like I said, 2.5 gallon of 1034.0, or say 3 gallon of a good, plain, rural blend. A lot of retailers offer. It's a little pricier, but it won't have any problems with it. Put your zinc in with it, and it gives you room to go ahead and put a biological if the field actually feel that you will get a return on it. It goes back to that organic matter distribution, biological activity, putting the field and all that. Am I going to get a payback on $15 input? But I think that laying that down there, you can't go too high of a rate of any nutrient, but that 5 gallon tank.
All right, next question. Should Tri-States expand the maintenance range for potassium by 12% to account for temporal instability? Not sure where you got the 12% from, but
That's what I talked about.
Okay, sorry.
Mm-hmm. They were listening. You weren't.
Okay. I guess I'll get some input on this and then pass it over to Dave, but we're part of 4Rs. We're very involved with that program, and not that they have necessarily direct impact on grading the Tri-States, but I can tell you that their parameters for accepting or not accepting soil test critical levels are looked at very closely, and they're going to probably be changing. They're a little bit lenient on passing in general. And further on the temporal part.
Yeah, so if you do that, 1,000 acres, 12% more fertilizer on 1,000 acres. We only need fertilizer on 10% of those acres. So purely from an economic standpoint, it doesn't make any sense to do that. The other part is we also have to think about it from an environmental perspective. And from an environmental perspective, we're over applying on, say, 80% to solve this problem. And that doesn't make any sense. So what makes sense, at least to me, is let's do a really good job of identifying where we have potassium issues and solve it that way. And we can do it by simply going into a shorter interval of 2 years. Yes, I got that. I'll let you handle the last one down there. If we soil sampled in dry fall 24 and potassium levels came back lower than expected, what should we do? So that it kind of, like my answer always is, it depends. If it's really, really like bizarrely off, then we probably should resample it and see what's going on. Typically, that's not what happens, but if that's the case, that's the case. It just builds my case again for what I would really suggest is that you get into a 2-year cycle, and now you're going to use that rolling average, and you're going to pull that through. I mean, the answer may be correct. They may be low. I mean, there's a 60 to 70% chance that's what's going on. Yes, I got one other one there. What is the optimal density to create an accurate K index? So that comes back to the spatial integrity, and it's no different than what it's been before, and that is as much as you can afford. I think if you're in a 2-year sampling cycle, work with your advisor. There's some other things that go into this from an economic standpoint purely. Like, is it a ground that may be short-term rental and you're not sure what's going to happen down the road? Maybe it's a ground that you're just know it's going to go away. That could influence the density. What you're trying to do, as far as if you're trying to build out seeding rects and some where you really need a high resolution, can make a difference. But in general, the general answer is someplace between, I think, doing half acre over half acre would be the most, and then the least would be 2 acre over 2 acre would be the range. And talk with your advisor and figure out what works best for you. You get to talk about RFK.
In a wide drop side dress program, what would you recommend to use on a high yield potential corn farm? And as a highway with side dress or fungicide at PA, or by fungicide.
In a wide drop, side dressing comes back. Someone needs to have what you put down there. But you're looking at coming across 5B6, got a sufficient amount of nitrogen put down with starter program, got your sulfur in it. So when we get up to that B5, B6, push off because of weather till B7, B8, heaven forbid, but it's happened. I don't know if I would want to late go B5 with the first side dressing just because pile. But you come back and as long as your total nitrogen, total applied nitrogen and your sulfur is up there in that 20 unit range, of the combination part of the other. I guess that's honestly the question I get. And then is Dyway with side dress or fungicide at P8 followed by the R2 lab. If I was planting corn in April, I would probably think that seen is the skyway application with the starter is pretty effective. Not in furrow, but a 2x2 placement, like so forth. And then follow that on an R2, R3 application, R2.5. There's a trade-off. Skyway's considerably more money than the fungicide, probably, or at least one that I would recommend at that V8 application. So you got $20 versus $6. Kind of lose your ability to throw in a boron application. So there's trade-offs. It's really how much risk do you want to take and how does it fit into your management plan? So I guess honestly, I've effectively answered that question. Kind of like Dave. And then zinc in furrow and planting and boron foliar on R1. Yes.
All right, got time for a couple more here. Do you recommend getting involved with NRCS for an IBM plan? Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends on who your local NRCS guy is. There's some that are better than others. Selfishly, I would say work with crop consultant like Integrated Ag. So there's a lot, going on with these equipment CSP programs to where 80% of the information is what we do. So I think we have a good fit for those programs. Definitely not the experts on all the background that goes into those programs, but from an agronomic data, definitely have that. For soybean spoiler, should I try boron, manganese, all? Wow, that's a good question.
I think what probably your biggest payback of the things that are up there, again, it depends on field conditions. What type of soils are you dealing with? But I would expect manganese to, just looking at a line there, I would expect to see your breeding concern from manganese.
That's for last year. This one is a little bit dangerous. A little off topic, but if RFK limits the sources of pesticides, what will our next best option? Yeah, I mean, the future of ag is, I think, I don't know what exactly it looks like, but there's technology, robotic weeding, think of a smaller equipment in the field, the mechanical weeding, all sorts of things. I don't know what's going to happen. I like to think that current administration is going to certainly support the farmer and that the farmer's not going to get hurt. And hopefully our new Secretary of Ag has a equation our current administration and they don't do anything crazy. Do you think micros can get into plant to the leaves, or does it need to go roots?
So, macros, not really. Okay, doesn't really get through the leaf that much. Secondaries to a lesser extent, they don't really get through there. But when we look at micros, it does pull it up through the roots. Because we've got it in the soil, it does pull it up as the plant feeds it, but they also, micros can get into it. It's more deficient. Look at manganese application. Well, we've got high organic out of ground, these are chlorotic. What are we doing? 7 B18, almost R1. We go in there, we apply manganese. We've all seen it. Turns around, changes the color, allows that photosynthesis to take place, to get back, mitigate that chlorosis tissue, and where we don't spray it, we've got 20% less beans. So looking at a 6-7%, that's probably got 6 or something. Therefore, we see our timeline. All of us have seen it, so it's
I don't know what amine nitrogen is.
I want
Neat.
to thank everybody for coming to this year's agronomy meeting. All this meeting is very informative, provide agronomic information, not salesy. Hopefully you guys took away 1, 2, 3 nuggets to take home with you. Hope everybody has a successful 2025 crop year. Anything you guys, please reach out to us. Website or also find one of our crop consultants. Love to work with you if we're not. With that, do we have any special instructions? Yes, we're just going to put up a thank you slide. It should have, I think, a barcode, yay, credits for me. Also a sign in there at the front as well. So, Michaela said that we're going to release tables for the lunch line. So, thank you again.
Oh, great. How you doing? Thank you. It's a complicated one, but I don't know about that. It is interesting that I don't know if you've seen it or not, but how it's just so much more prevalent today than it was, I want to say 10 years ago, but
Yeah, agreed.
yeah, John. Yeah, you can use it.